He once held the fields like a crown. Sunlight lay thick on the coffee rows, and his shadow ran over the leaves like a promise. Now, under that same relentless noon, a pale man bent over a burlap sack and scooped beans with hands that knew both the touch of silk and the sting of a whip. They called him Tirso. They called him mad. He did not answer. How does a man lose a name? How does a name, once spoken in rooms of power and in the hush of family prayers, become a sound that belongs to someone else? This is the story of that loss, and of the moment when his memory returned with a violence that could not undo what had already been done. If you want to follow stories that pull at the past to explain the present, subscribe now and stay with me. There are more like this to come. The house on the hill had once been an assertion, a stone facade, shutters dark as a man's mood, and a row of glass that held like a polished eye every coming and going across the estate. Heitor de Albuquerque moved through those rooms as if he had invented the order of the world. He was a baron by name and a master by habit. His voice could make men tremble. His signature could change another man's fate. He had learned to measure things by their obedience. Land, like people, was something to be commanded. Rebecca moved differently in that house. She wore grief as if it were a shawl, always there, sometimes heavy, sometimes barely felt. She loved with the steadiness of a woman who had learned to hold a brittle world together. She had married Heitor when she was young, and because she believed in the shape of the man beneath the title. The years showed her the layers he had, and the habits that neither his money nor his eloquence could soften. In the deeper rooms of the plantation, where light thinned and dust settled like a kind of hush, there was a desk that had belonged to Heitor's grandfather. It was a wide, stubborn thing of drawers and secret hollows. In a corner drawer, under papers of accounts and receipts, there was a small compartment lined in felt. The old man had once hidden a testament there, a writing that named heirs and conditions that could end a dispute or start one. Heitor kept the memory of that compartment like a private assurance. It was the one object that grounded his sense of continuity. A paper could bind property claims, could protect a lineage. For men like him, a document was a shield and a blade. Opposite the House of Light on a neighboring slope, Ignacio Bastos ran a different kind of presence. His house was less imposing but quicker of edge. Where Heitor had the weight of generations, Bastos had a restless hunger. He smiled with a patience that never admitted enough. Between them, the land was a geography of old arguments, lines drawn on maps, fences disputed, and two men measuring status with the same narrow rule. Bastos did not respect the old claims. He respected only advantage. Their rivalry carried the smell of coffee and iron. It was played in small gestures, a field marked, a horse intercepted, a signature delayed. When talkativeness turned to threat, the two men no longer spoke as neighbors, but as predators sharpening tactics. Bastos learned over years that power could be taken in softer ways than by force. He learned that paper and persuasion could do what an army could not. On a late morning that smelled of rain and dust, Heitor decided to ride to Bastos's farm. He had reason, sharp and private, to confront him, an encroachment that could not go unanswered, a suspicious deed that reeked of forgery. He did not take his foreman or his man of letters. He took, as always, his certainty. The path between estates was narrow, rimmed with fig trees and wild coffee. The horse moved fast, a brief blur of muscle. The world contracted to breath and hoofbeat and the hollow of the saddle beneath a man who believed in his own invincibility. Heitor's mind rehearsed the words he would use. It was not the first quarrel he would settle. It would not be the last. Then the slope changed. The horse misjudged a rut. A stone hid itself under grass. The animal's front legs folded. Heitor pitched forward, and his skull met rock with a sound less like a breaking than like the sudden collapse of expectation. The wind left him. The world tilted into a smear of green, a silver of light, and then a black that was not sleep, but a cliff edge called absence. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer Heitor, not at least by the law that made a man the center of his own recollection. Names, faces, the root of his life, those threads lay severed. Time remained. Only the map of his life had been erased. He lay among leaves, with a bleeding bruise upon his temple, and a hand that remembered the warmth of something it could not name. An old man named Tobias found him. Tobias walked the back roads like one who had no business anywhere and found shelter everywhere. He was part fiddler, part trader in small favors. His hands were stained by tobacco and work. When he happened upon the collapsed rider, Tobias felt the old instinct to help. He rose the body, felt for a pulse, ran a trembling hand over a face he did not know, and muttered a prayer. The man did not speak back. He had no papers, no purse, no ring. Tobias judged him dead enough, and, fearful of the scent of trouble that hangs where men fall, he left. He left because he feared the consequences of being found near a stranger who might yet be a lord's scandal or the starting point of a vendetta. He left, and that departure would be one of the small choices that became the scaffolding of a larger crime. It was a slow misfortune that finished Hator's fate. Hunters, some paid in coin, some eager for the reward of a commodity, found the man later. They lifted him, wrapped him in coarse cloth, and took him to the nearest market town where human worth was weighed in hands and questions were kept short. Hator could not speak for himself. When they jabbed him with a question, he could not answer. When they pressed who he was and the name did not come, they saw opportunity. In the mouths of traders and magistrates, confusion is a doorway. He was sold as Pardo, unnamed, a man without a social anchor. They branded him, not with letters and lineage, but with the word that separated him from the small class of those whose skin or document might save them. The stamps of leather and iron found a place on his flesh and announced to anyone who looked that he belonged to the market's category. The new owners called him Tirso. Santa Cruz was a place of sun and heat and the constant motion of harvest. It was also a place where names could be reassigned by contract and by cruelty. He was placed on a plantation whose owner thought of land as a ledger and people as entries. There, stripped of garments that had once fit silk, stripped of modes of command, Hator learned the geometry of a different world, the bend of waste, the pace of a labor day, the rhythm of a harvest that never allowed looking up to the sky without fear of falling behind. 5 harvests came and went. Time in those years was a kind of erosion. It wore the edge off muscle and mind both. The mornings began with the same bell, the same shout. The sun rose and the work bent bodies until the vertebrae learned new alignments. Hunger found a place beneath the ribs. The overseers carried their whips as a language. Their cracks were lectures and punctuation. But the violence needed not to be punctured in detail. It lived in the constant presence of threat, in the way the body learned to anticipate a fist by tightening a jaw, in the small furtive exchanges of bread and of whispered plans among those who had nothing but their names and one another. Tirso learned 2 kinds of memory, the one that had been stolen from him in the fall, the names of his house, the ledger in the desk, the face of Rebecca, and the memory that grew from the new life itself, the faces of the people who shared his bread, the places where shade could be found, the rhythm of the coffee shrubs in rain and drought. He began to recognize the shape of another world as a map on which he might in time place himself. There were people who would not let him be entirely erased. Anna, a woman whose hands were made for mending and for holding children, named small things to him. "You keep to that corner today, Tirso." She taught him to avoid the overseer's path. Joaquim, who had been in the trade longer than anyone remembered, traded stories for extra servings, old stories that were not about barons or titles, but about how to cross a river without wet boots, or how to look a master in the eye and reckon the price of a stare. Maria, who had once sewn finery for the houses of the region, taught him how to pick the seam between a garment and a man's sense of worth. These were not saviors, nor were they simple background. They were companions in a shared reality, people who carried their own histories and kept them fiercely. At times, pieces of his past drifted into Tirso like a scent catching on the wind, the clink of crystal somewhere in a memory, a particular way of folding a letter, a child's lullaby that belonged to a particular childhood room. Once, while he bent to scoop beans, his fingers brushed a small piece of polished glass, an old marble perhaps, that lay in the soil. It rolled smooth between his palms, and the motion hit him like a bell. For a second, the world flashed as if a curtain were pulled aside. A room, the exact pattern of light on the grandfather's desk, his own hand closing around a paper that smelled of dust and ink. He startled, and the moment dissolved. The others saw the slack in his face and shook him gently back to task. Anna whispered, "You dreamed again?" He could not tell whether it had been dream or memory. Either way, it left him hollow with longing. Inside the house that once belonged to him, the absence had produced its own storms. Rebecca refused to sit in the parlor where her husband had once eaten. She went through the rooms as if through a house that had been raided by time. She hired men to search the ridges, asked neighbors, and wept behind doors. People told her that Heitor was gone, that perhaps he had ridden away to some business and would return. The courtyard held a silence, like the hush after a sermon. Bastos held his own counsel in those months, with a patience that smelled of a trap. He did not simply want the land, he wanted to make the claim stick, so that later resistance would be more difficult. He had cultivated relationships inside the local bureaucracy, men who liked coin more than a clean conscience. A few signatures moved like seeds, forged not by a single hand, but aided by the slow municipal rot of men who took bribes or who preferred no trouble to an inconvenient inquiry. Documents appeared that suggested Heitor had been reckless with debts, that an old deed had an addendum that favored Bastos, that a certain margin of land had always been in question. The law, which in theory balanced truth, in practice bowed easily to a confident lie pressed on a clerk's desk. Rodrigo Tavares de Mello was a neighbor and a magistrate's officer whose duty sometimes collided with his self-interest. He watched the contest between Heitor and Bastos with an eye that measured profit in quiet ways. Friends advised Rebecca to press harder. Others suggested she accept a settlement and buy time with the safety of some immediate security. Rebecca refused to negotiate the name of her home for comfort. She knocked on Rodrigo's door in the rain and demanded that he look into reports that Bastos had petitioned to take over part of the estate. Rodrigo read through papers and sighed in an official way. He promised inquiries, he promised letters. Promises are spices that soothe the anxious. Bastos, meanwhile, kept his counsel and his pen offered when men needed a signature. When the auction came, when the market's crowd and the smell of animals and the crude brass of buyers' bracelets circled like predators, the men who trafficked in the human commodity did not ask for a name. They asked only for the shape of a body and the price. Heitor's new owners treated him as they treated any man they had purchased, a measure of labor and a cost of later profit. They gave him a name that did not belong to him, an administrative sound to be barked as a control. Tirso. The name stuck because that was what they needed to call him from row to row. It would be a mistake to think that such a reassignment breaks a soul in a day. Memory is more patient, more subterranean. Months passed before Tirso fully wore the skin of his assigned role. The first seasons left him raw. Later, the edges dulled. He learned to measure the sun differently. There are conveniences in enforced repetition. Clothes get mended in the same way. Food keeps arriving in the same scarce amounts. The whip follows predictable patterns. He found, too, that the people around him were not blank. They had histories and griefs. They trusted him with small confidences because he had shown, in small ways, that he would not take more than he could give. He had not yet remembered himself as Heitor, but he began to remember how to be present, how to listen. He thought sometimes of the desk with its hidden compartment. Sometimes the thought came like a sound of water behind stone, distant but insistent. The possibility of a paper that could speak his name stayed like an ember in his mind. It was dangerous to kindle such hope. The plantation's household had its eyes. A man who began to ask the wrong questions brought attention that could be fatal. Tirso kept the ember small. He watched the house from a distance. He learned the coming and going of the household servants. He watched the night lamps through the craw of distance and learned where shadows gathered. There was a rumor that floated across plantations, that sometimes if a man had once been a master and then was made slave by misfortune, a document, hidden or forgotten, could, when shown, nullify the bargain. The rumor moved not just as a legal notion, but as a wish. Maps, testimony, and sealed parchment could reassert order. Tirso held such an idea like a pebble in his pocket, small, useless perhaps, yet weighty enough to remind him that the world might accept a different accounting. In the house where the lamp burned and the paper that might save him lay folded, things moved without him. Men like Bastos had practiced the arts of erasure. They had accounts arranged, men bribed, and a narrative made of slips that put Heiter beyond the reach of those who might seek him. The registries in the town were crowded with names that changed hands, and Bastos had learned which corners of bureaucracy needed gentle pressure to bend. On the plantation, Tirso learned of other small adjustments. A missing ledger, a servant whose loyalties shifted when the right coin appeared, a steward who suddenly appreciated a quiet life and was willing to sell the secret of which drawers belonged to him. It is easy to undervalue small betrayals in the service of a larger theft. Each one fits into the hand like a brick. Bastos's theft was not a single monstrous act, but a careful assembling of bricks and mortar, bribes, false testimony, and the slow smoothing of records. Rebecca found a thread in the tangle. She held it with the stubbornness of someone who refused to surrender identity to rumor. She found men who remembered Heiter's handwriting. A seamstress found a cufflink with a tiny emblem matched to a family crest. She placed pleas before Rodrigo. For a while the answers were thin as leaves. Men who held the law's instruments recoiled at complicating the status quo. After all, Bastos spoke with the assurance of a man who had already carved space for himself in the ledger. The moment that changed the visible stakes came quietly enough. In a year when rain had been slower and the coffee was thin, a trellis on the border fence had come apart. It was simple labor, a mending for a fence line, nothing of a legal nature, and so the overseer assigned the task to Tirso and 2 others. He walked the fence, palm on rough wood, and heard a voice from the distance, a voice on the property, yet not among those who daily labored. It was high, choked, the sound of one who had been crying. "Heitor," the woman said. The name was a strike in the sun. The syllable cut across the morning like a blade. It reached him raw in the chest, as if someone had thrown a name into the hollow of him and watched it catch. It is a pedestrian thing to think that names can simply be words. Names are anchors. For Tirso it was at once a knife and a compass. The sound of it unlocked a room inside him he had thought was brick-lined and sealed. Images rushed, the desk, the little compartment with its felt lining, the glass marble rolling between his fingers, the shape of Rebecca's hand as she had once taken his. He stopped mid-breath, the plank of the trellis pressed against his thigh. The moment held like a photograph, not yet developed, but the light had been recorded. Someone nearby, the overseer perhaps, or one of the other laborers, saw the slack in his face and moved toward him with the practiced suspicion of those who know a fever when they see one. Tirso did not cry out. He found his throat dry as old bone. His mouth shaped the name without sound. He mouthed it like a secret. The woman's voice was swallowed by distance, by a gust of wind over the crop. The call had the argument of a hand on a door that slams and refuses to be opened quietly. He tried to say the name aloud and could not. His tongue felt heavy with sediment. The fear in his chest was not legal. It was animal. If he raised his head, he would invite attention. If he did not, the spark of recognition might fade forever. He learned in the days that followed that the world had become clever about memory. Speaking the truth in public brought with it a risk one cannot always survive. The house held men whose ears were bought and whose smiles were ready. To announce Heitor's identity in the wrong place was to invite a question that could be turned into proof of madness. Those who had already parted a man from his name had a taste for retribution. Thus he kept his mouth shut and let the spark glow quietly in his chest. The years that followed pulled him into new patterns. He mapped the household movements from a distance, learned which windows let in the scent of baked bread, which rooms held the sound of argument, and where a servant's cart might pass with bundles unseen. He found allies in the least likely of persons, a page who, when he dropped a small scrap of cloth, pocketed it and later nudged it to him, a stable boy who left a bit of sawn leather by the fence. Those were trifles, but in a landscape carved by law and muscle, trifles could be amassed into leverage. Bastos, meanwhile, moved closer to sealing his advantage. This was not simply the arrogance of someone who had taken another's place. It was the careful work of making the theft seem lawful. He pressed for registrations, for transfers. He had the advantage of immediacy. The land was present and could be tended, and men prefer a living order to the chaos of a contested title. When a magistrate looked about and saw a plantation being worked, The mind is inclined to accept the appearance of order as the truth of it. Bastos's men worked nights to rearrange certain records. They found a clerk who had once been slighted by Hator and offered him an indirect kindness. When Rebecca persisted, her dignity was a small echo in a loud room. She sought Rodrigo's counsel again and again. Some days his sympathy seemed real, some days it leaned toward the institutional patience of those who protect stability. Rebecca grew thinner. She placed the house's history in the hands of people who had their fingers greased. Sometimes she thought of the Old Testament hidden in the desk. Sometimes she thought of Hator's laugh when they argued about foolish things. Loss will shape a person into a kind of detective, searching corners, retrieving small tokens. She collected anything that might be proof and learned in the process the legal vocabulary that could bring back what had been taken. Back in the fields, Tirso counted the circuits of the sun and counted his own patience. He did what he must to survive. He kept his head low and his mind high. Memory, when it returns in fragments, can be a cruel mercy. It knows what you have lost, and it offers nothing but the price of knowledge. That was the beginning of his quiet plan. Not a rush of revenge, not a palaver of proclamation, but a slow assembling of evidence and a readiness to act when the right thing dropped into his hands. It was not only law he needed, it was trust. He would need a witness who would not be bought, a hand that would place a document in a magistrate's room and not turn it into bargaining coin. He would need an audience that could withstand the sharpness of Bastos's denials and the sway of those who preferred an end to conflict. Above all, he would need the proof that only the old desk might supply, a testament signed in ink and sealed with a grandfather's hand. So Tirso watched. He learned the timing of the household, the cadence of doors, the men who came and went. His days were a ledger of small observations, and within that ledger he kept an entry that read like a hope. In the house above him, Rebecca moved like a ghost threaded with purpose. She had not given up. Her search had become a slow hunting. Men like Rodrigo and Bastos had decided where their favors lay. The rest would be a question of whether the small, patient truths could outlast the cobbled lies. One afternoon, while he mended a broken trellis and the air tasted of coming rain, Tirso heard the name again. It fell from lips that trembled and that carried a sorrow like a bell. The sound threaded through his limbs. He caught it and held it as one catches a bird, and felt suddenly the old world clench like a fist around a small, forgotten thing. The recognition arrived like a physical ache. He stood very still. The sound of the name swelled and then unspooled into a silence so dense that it seemed to press against his ear. He wanted to speak. He wanted to stand and declare the truth in a voice that would rend the thin veil Bastos had cast over everything. But he knew the cost. He had been made into a thing whose testimony would be read as madness if spoken in the wrong hour. That afternoon closed with a storm on the horizon. The plantation's horizon is a line of restless grey when rain threatens, a promise and a threat all at once. Tirso walked back to the rows with a bent that was both the posture of a labourer and of a man carrying a secret. The name had opened something, but it had not yet given him a plan. It had only given him a wound that remembered its original shape. The slow gears of Bastos's plot ground on. The clerks wrote, the signatures were smoothed, the deeds were altered with the care of those who reforge history. Rebecca kept searching. Tirso kept watching. The land continued to sweat in the heat, and the men toiled in a rhythm that seemed designed to deprive the mind of intervals where thought could breathe. It would be easy to say that the next steps were inevitable, that the discovery and the trial were mechanistic outcomes. But nothing of the kind had yet occurred. The world still held its breath. Names like seeds can germinate under hostile soil. They can also wither if not tended. The small ember inside Tirso needed oxygen and kindling, an ally who would not flinch when the paper was shown. It needed the courage of Rebecca's endurance and the restraint of those who could be trusted. As the first thunderheads rolled, Tirso lifted his hand to his temple where an old scar throbbed and where bone met memory. He thought of the desk and of the marble and of the lamp flame that had once cast shadows that meant something true. He thought of the sound of a woman calling his name. The storm drew nearer, and the plantation squatted under a sky that looked like a lid. There are moments in the life of a man when memory chooses to be merciful and moments when it is cruelty itself. That evening, as the first drops fell, he tried to speak the one name he still feared to utter. It rose in him like smoke and died on his lips. The storm broke the fields open and washed them with a violence that spoke in thunder. Under that water things changed, sometimes slightly, sometimes irreparably. Tirso listened to the rain. He had nothing to lose and everything to remember. Outside the house, in rooms that had once been his by inheritance, men moved papers and made plans. Inside the damp soil of the coffee bushes, a man who had been a baron and had become a nameless labourer kept a secret in the shape of his memory. The next day would require choices that could not be reversed, choices that would set into motion a reckoning not only of property, but of responsibility. He did not yet know what he would do with the truth if it came. But a name, once heard, had a tendency to demand an audience. A name once heard had a tendency to demand an audience. He kept the sound inside him like a lit coal, warm enough to burn but small enough not to flare. Days folded into one another with the same ache. He would move among the bushes, hands picking the beans, and the syllable would press at the base of his throat. He did not speak it aloud. He watched, he learned, he waited. The first real test of his restraint arrived in the market at Santa Cruz, where men came to trade cattle, to shout prices, and to measure one another by the loudness of a purse. A travelling preacher had stopped in town. His voice cut the day. People gathered. There was singing. Rebecca, who had never been a woman of many public appearances, had come with a few acquaintances who believed the rumour that her husband might yet be found. She stood among the crowd, rain-damp hair pinned, eyes like a fastened prayer, and when she called the name it landed like a bell. "Heitor!" The word travelled through the throng and found him like a compass needle finding north. For a moment, the world around Tirso resembled the vivid interior of a fever, the preacher's voice blurring into the sound of a river, the crowd's faces condensing into a single pane of glass, Rebecca's silhouette sharp against the blue. He rose, instinct and memory pushing him forward. He opened his mouth to answer. A shout cut across him. He had not noticed the men who lurked at the edge of the gathering, men whose business was to keep order in the form that paid their employer. Bastos had friends in places where disputes dissolved into recommendations. One of them grabbed Tirso's shoulder, hard enough to drag him from the crowd's center. "Quiet, Tirso," the man said, as if naming him were an act that would keep them safe. The crowd saw a strange man disturbed, and their curiosity curdled into suspicion. Heitor had forgotten the thinness of mercy in public. He tried again to speak his name. This time a voice, Bastos' voice, rose from among the men. "Madness," Bastos announced to the crowd with a casual cruelty, "wanders where men talk to ghosts. Best leave him to his work." A ripple of laughter smoothed the moment. The sheriff's deputy, an obliging man who preferred avoiding trouble, hauled Tirso toward the whipping post as if reasserting some civic order. A troublemaker must be subdued. The lash did not need to tear to impress. It needed to be a demonstration. The first strokes were like a punctuation of warning. The overseers kept count with coarse talk. Tirso hunched. The world narrowed to the sound of leather and the salt-sour sting on his back. He tasted blood and fear both. He did not cry out. When the blows finished, his spine had a new memory to hold, and his voice had been bruised in such a way that speaking louder only invited new attention. He was led back to the fields not as a man who had attempted a truth, but as a spectacle that confirmed the order Bastos wanted the town to see. After that day his patience hardened into resolution. He could not afford public proclamations. He could not risk the brittle mercy of a magistrate moved by an eloquent woman. Bastos had already taught much of the county's administration how to favor comfort over inquiry. Proof, not fervor, would be his deliverance. He would need the paper that tied his name to his land, the thing Bastos had moved to erase. He began to think like a man reclaiming a mapped territory. Small steps, pattern observation, gathering of people who possessed small but decisive information. The household had a dozen hands who moved through its rooms. Each carried a secret like a pebble. Some were willing to trade, some would demand a price in loyalty, and some would refuse for reasons of conscience. Tirso watched who came with letters at dusk, who took coffers to the clerk, which servant knew which drawer was used to hide private receipts. A key to the house's rhythm arrived unexpectedly. On a damp evening when the lamp in the steward's office burned low and the rain made the shutters clap like tired hands, the steward, an old man fond of comfort, fell ill for a day. The substitute who took his place was young and slack, and he misshelved a bundle of papers, leaving a corner of the desk's drawer slightly ajar when the household settled into the night. A young page, who had taken a fancy to Tirso's steady silence, forgot to lock the pantry, and the crack of the kitchen door provided the breadth Tirso required. He moved that night like a shadow that had learned to walk in daylight. He had watched the desk from a distance for months, and knew, by temperament and curiosity, how much a drawer resisted a hand that had not handled its grain. His fingers found the false bottom by the light of a single oil flaring beneath a distant window. Something small and wrapped in oiled cloth slid into his palm, the weight of folded paper and a ribbon older than most of the signatures in the register. He should not have been surprised when, instead of joy, a cold panic rose inside him. The paper meant exposure. The paper meant movement. He wrapped the testament back in the cloth, held it to his chest, and fled into the rain. He did not take the document to the market or to the first magistrate he could find. He went to the one man who had no price he could imagine the world buying, Padre Matias. The priest lived a short walk from the plantation, in a whitewashed house with a garden of herbs and a bell that had long since become a soft thing in the wind. Padre Matias was not a man of grand speeches. He spoke in small sentences and in the kind of caution reserved for people who had seen too many confidences misused. He had officiated baptisms and funerals across both estates, and in the small exchange between confession and counsel he had acquired a reputation that made men trust him not because he was a judge, but because his conscience could not be rented. Tirso approached him at dawn, soaked through, the testament sealed with a family signet half visible beneath the rain-smudged wax. The priest recognized him at once, not by name, but by the stubborn set of a man standing at a doorway where he did not belong. Padre Matias did not ask for a paper to be read aloud in the garden. He took the testament as a thing of weight and consequence. He read it under the hush of morning light. His face, when he looked up, did not show triumph. It showed the calculation of a man who understood the danger of a truth unprotected. "Bring me witnesses," he said quietly, the syllables acting like oars, steering something fragile back to shore. "Bring what you can. Leave the rest with me." The decision to involve a priest rather than a magistrate first was tactical. A priest could hold the paper in sacrament and discretion. A magistrate's involvement meant immediate public process, which Bastos could manipulate. Padre Matias agreed to hide the testament until the moment when it could be revealed in a forum, where not only law, but community attention would make falsification costly. Word spread in hushed patterns. The page who had left the pantry unlatched, ashamed for the favor, volunteered to move news. Anna and Joachim, whose small kindnesses had kept Tirso's ember alive, began to listen for the steps of the cart that took documents into town. Maria, who had sewn the hems of the house's finer coats, had once mended a family letter and recognized the stitching of the ribbon on the testament. They were not passive tools. They chose the risk of aid because the hope of justice outweighed their fear. Each act of help was a deliberate reclaiming of dignity. Bastos, perceptive in the clean way of men used to managing fortune, sensed a shift too. He did not expose his suspicion in folly. Instead, he tightened the screws of his own small world. He increased the patrol by which he measured labor. He made ostentatious visits to the magistrate's office, and he began to plant rumors about a madman who called names to disturb a quiet life. He wanted the indictment to be madness rather than truth. Madness could be controlled. Proof unsettled him because it could not be bribed away so simply. The plan, when Tirso and his allies sketched it among the shadows, was lean and risked everything on a few acts of courage. Padre Matias would carry the testament to Rodrigo Tavares de Mello, the magistrate whose reputation was tarnished, but whose office still held the power to read an instrument publicly. They would stage the presentation on a day when the town was full of visitors, the market day, so that witnesses would be numerous, and Bastos's ability to quietly sway a clerk diminished. Rodrigo, they believed, had a private integrity buried beneath his compromises. He had been Heitor's neighbor, and might remember the man himself if presented with the document and an unassailable corroboration. There was a complication they had not counted on: the magistrate's dependence on appearances. In Santa Cruz, legitimacy often rode on a ceremony. A will presented by a priest carried gravity, but only if the man who claimed the name could pass some private tests of identity. No court would simply accept a scrap of paper and a priest's solemnity. Memory, the kind only a person could provide, would be a necessary supplement. Tirso understood what the magistrate would demand. He had the scar above the left eyebrow where the rock had kissed his skull. He could recount minor incidents known only to the household. He could speak of the pattern of the grandfather's ink, the way the wax seal had been pressed, but he would have to do it indirectly, or else risk an open collapse in which Bastos's men would shout madness and throw the paper into doubt. Padre Matias devised the test. Rodrigo would meet him privately, alone with the testament, and the priest would describe what the paper contained. The magistrate would then set questions not to the paper, but to the man who claimed to be Heitor. He would ask for details only the family would know. He would look for a scar, an old habit, the name of a servant who had been with the household since a child. The private confirmation would be the hinge. If the magistrate believed, he would order a public reading and put his office behind the act. The night before the planned presentation, the rain returned and the plantation smelled like turned earth and wet leaves. Tirso lay under a coarse blanket that had once been a curtain, the paper folded next to him in an oilskin that Padre Matias had supplied. He felt the weight of what would come, not only the exposure of an identity but the collision with the truth of his past. Memory, he had learned, could not be partitioned. The same mouth that could say the name Heitor had in it the tone of command that had once broken men. He slept fitfully, dreams thick with the face of those he had ordered, and when he woke, his cheeks were wet with sweat like a private confession. The presentation at Rodrigo's office did not proceed as a triumph, but as a trembling assertion. Padre Matias held the testament in both hands as if it were a sacrament. He spoke with the slow economy of a man who has weighed sins and made a small ledger of favors owed. Rodrigo read, his finger tracking the ink lines. In those strokes lived a grandfather's hand, the old flourishes Heitor had been taught to expect, the clause that named heirs in a pattern only kin could decipher. Then the private test. Rodrigo locked the office door as though his person too needed protection. He called Tirso in, the man who had once been carried by horses and now came on worn feet. Tirso walked into the room under the light of a single lamp. The magistrate looked for signs, more interested in a certainty that could be pinned than in the rhetoric of a priest. He asked about the desk, the exact location, the smell of the felt lining. He asked about a small scar behind the right thumb, a boy's fight scar Heitor had been known to bear as a token of boyishness. He asked the name of a nurse who had once served the family and, to everyone's surprise, asked a detail no one else could know. The childish phrase Heitor had once used to hush a baby, an odd little rhyme with no value but family value. Tirso answered. He answered because the memories had returned whole and painfully honest. He spoke halting at times, the words shaped by a man who had both learned to soften and had remembered the directness of command. He showed the scar above the eyebrow, the small crescent of healed skin where the rock had kissed him. He remembered the rhyme and the hidden hollow of the desk. Rodrigo's hand rested on the paper a long moment. Outside, Bastos's allies knocked on doors and made bland inquiries, trying to prepare a counter-narrative. When Rodrigo stepped out into the hall, he did not shout. He folded the testament and, with the gravity of a man who had chosen to redeem a piece of himself, ordered a public reading that same day. The public reading was designed to deny Bastos the ease of quiet bribery. Men travelled from adjacent estates. The market swelled with faces whose interest in the trial would make tampering visible. The magistrate read the testament aloud from the town hall's bench. The ink named Heitor de Albuquerque set forth a bequest that demonstrated not only lineage, but the presence of a document that would be difficult to forge, a sequence of codicils and marginalia that bore the handwriting of multiple witnesses. Rodrigo's voice did not rise. It carried the heavy, steady note of law. Bastos's response was swift and shrill. He proclaimed forgery. He sent forward a clerk who denied knowledge of the signatures, offered a set of papers that supposedly demonstrated a different chain of title, and accused the priest of collusion. But the town's air had changed. The number of witnesses present muted the sway Bastos had enjoyed in closed bureaucratic rooms. Men who had once taken his coins in private felt the eyes of a community upon them. The clerk who had once been their ally muttered contradictions under the weight of being seen. The decisive moment came with testimony from the house itself. An elderly steward, who had been paid well in the past but whose conscience had begun to gnaw at him, recognized the ink's flourishes. He spoke of a habit, the grandfather's method of lining the paper with a thin wash of gum that darkened at the fold. The man's voice trembled when he admitted the small favor he had done for the family in folding letters for decades. His admission loosened other tongues. A seamstress identified the unique thread used to tie a packet of the family's heirlooms. A former page described the pattern of a lullaby. These small facts multiplied into the kind of proof a court could live off. Bastos proved what he had always been, a man who expected to be believed when convenience favored him. But the court required more than cunning. When Rodrigo pronounced the will valid, the room inhaled as if a single organism had been relieved. Bastos was arrested on charges of fraud and the procurement of false documents. The local men who had altered registry entries were taken into custody, their complicity exposed by the weight of presence and testimony. The restitution of property, however, did not feel like the return of a single man to a throne. Heitor reclaimed the land not as a coronation, but as a burden. The papers named him living and rightful heir, yet when he stood where once a master had towered, it felt different. He had dug ditches and bent under the same sun as those now standing beside him. The reclamation of legal title did not erase 5 harvests of hands shaped to work, nor did it restore the trust he'd shattered. The first thing he did after the court's formalities was to walk the plantation and look at faces. He walked slowly, mindful that his presence would be a temptation to anger or a provocation to hope. The people he had once ordered now watched him like a man returning from a long and punitive exile, and not all welcomed him. Some spat in his direction, some turned their heads away. Others, like Ana and Joaquim, stood with their chins lifted, not in adulation, but in assessive attention. Maria's eyes were small and guarded. Heitor did not make grand proclamations that day. He made a small practical start. He brought the steward who had testified into a private conversation, asked for lists, for registers, for records of promises owed to labor. He ordered that the first pay cycle be retroactive for a season, not by charity but by ledger. Wages given for a fixed past period to be distributed to those who had worked his lands. He signed manumissions for those who wished to leave, and offered land parcels with sharecropping arrangements for those who wanted to remain but under new terms. He would later codify a system of wages, regular paydays, and a council made up of formerly enslaved people who would advise on agricultural decisions. The reforms were not fast enough for some and not generous enough for others. There was anger, and there was justified suspicion. Heitor met both with a kind of stubborn humility that surprised even him. He wrote letters, formal apologies and concrete offers of reparation, to those whom he had wronged, asking their choice of recompense by the terms they wanted. Some accepted land, some wanted money, some wanted nothing he could give. For many, the idea of freedom accompanied by restitution was inconceivable. They had learned to look at promises with the same caution reserved for storms. Heitor understood this. He did not demand gratitude. He asked, slowly, for a chance to prove his change. Rebecca's return was more complicated than ceremony allowed. She did not run to him. She did not arrange a door-to-door reconciliation. She came to the house and sat in a parlor that had once been their shared domain and listened to him speak. He addressed the room the way a man addresses contrition, directly, filled with specifics, listing wrongs he had done by name. He did not ask for easy forgiveness. He confessed, in a voice that sometimes broke, that he had been a man whose decisions could not be excused by poverty of memory. Rebecca's answers were measured. She had lived with anger and grief and had carried them like a stone in a pocket. She told him plainly that the loss of the years could not be returned, and that the people who had suffered had claims upon him not erased by a title. Yet she also said she had seen him in the fields with hands not used to ordering, and that her fear of who he might become without remembering was now replaced by the knowledge of what he chose to do with the memory when it came back. Their reconciliation was a patient negotiation. She set boundaries. She insisted on witnessing the changes. She did not erase the past. She rationed her trust. He accepted these terms with a humility that felt like penance and like honesty combined. Their marriage did not become an idyll. It resumed as a partnership in which one had to earn the right to be heard. Healing, when it came, was not an event, but a long and costly labor. Heiter convened a council that included men and women who had been his laborers, those who had chosen to stay, and community elders. They formed a committee to adjudicate land distribution, to set fair wages, and to design apprenticeships that would allow those formerly enslaved to own the knowledge that made the plantations profitable. He offered contracts that stipulated profit sharing, and he funded a small common fund out of his own wealth for tuition for children. It was not an act of nobility so much as an architectural attempt to reconstitute trust where trust had been structurally destroyed. Not everyone believed this attempt would hold. Joachim, who had seen too many promises break, refused a land parcel at first. He had a sister who had been sold away in the market, and the idea that a deed could compensate for absence seemed hollow. Only after months, after regular pay arrived and a small schoolhouse opened with a teacher funded by Heitor, did Joachim consent to a cautious collaboration. Maria, who had sewn for houses and seen the goods of many change hands, demanded a formal role in the new council and was given authority over labor allocations. Her appointment was not symbolic. She used it to secure work conditions and to ensure that wages were paid in both coin and food. Tobias returned, older, smaller, and bent with the knowledge of a man who had made a minor cowardly choice and lived with its consequences. He had found Heiter once and left. The memory of his hands on a body he had abandoned had haunted him. He came to the house not to plead for forgiveness, but to offer testimony. Tobias stood in the council and confessed, plainly and without seeking absolution, that he had found the collapsed rider and had left him for fear of being accused of killing a lord. He apologized. The public admission cost him little legally, but stripped him of a certain anonymity. His confession was not a drama. It was a human act that many received, with a complicated mix of anger and compassion. Some spat quietly, others patted his shoulder. Heitor accepted Tobias's account without bitterness and later assigned him small work and some modest pay, an act that looked less like reward and more like a mutual attempt to repair a social fabric frayed by fear. The reforms did not stop with wages and land. Heitor pushed for changes that would challenge local exploitation. He insisted that the overseers be selected with community input, that any person accused of mistreatment be tried in a council that involved laborers and neighbors, and that the plantation's books be kept in a place accessible to representatives of the workers. He used his regained status to advocate for harsher scrutiny of document transfers in the region and to fund a clerk's office whose staff could be rotated to avoid the seduction of local collusion. These measures were small structural shifts, but they mattered. They began the labor of making rights less fragile in a town built on favors and silence. He did not, however, attempt to rewrite his past into virtue. When survivors, men and women who had been whipped, whose family members had been sold, whose children had been taken, spoke of what he had done, he listened. He did not ask for their forgiveness. He sat with their anger. When a man publicly accused him of indignities once performed on the house's orders, Heitor answered not with denial, but with a proposal: restitution, names of overseers, an offer to testify as a witness in trials. He looked their faces and let their contempt be instructive. For some he could never close a debt. Some wounds were permanent. The knowledge of that permanence framed his remaining years. Not all the consequences took place on the plantation. Bastos, after his arrest, was tried in a court that applied the period's law. He was found guilty of fraud and of procuring false documents. He lost land and money and was fined. Those fines, by order of Rodrigo and under strong pressure from public witnesses, were in part used to fund payments to those whose labor the fraud had so easily appropriated. Bastos's sentence was hard, but not cruelly designed to satisfy revenge. It was designed to make theft unrewarding in the eyes of men who might contemplate such an act. Bastos's social standing dwindled. He watched as his name no longer opened doors. Power, once taken by law, can erode as certain as a fence left to rot. The legal redress could not erase the personal. The men and women emerging from bondage carried scars, of body, soul, and of the missing kin whose faces never returned. Hator sat with those costs in quiet hours. In the dim reach of the house's library, he would write long lists of debts and names and try to calculate a fair share. He learned, in failing to make numbers speak for sorrow, to sit patient with what could not be counted. He consented to counsel from those he had once ruled. He listened more than he spoke. Years passed. The plantation, under the new arrangements, changed texture. There was a schoolhouse where at first a handful of children gathered. There was a market day in which laborers could offer produce without fear of being claimed. Shareholdings altered the way land was stewarded. The coffee itself was no longer a single man's wealth, but a patchwork enterprise with multiple stakeholders. It did not become Eden. Disputes arose. Old resentments flared. New ambitions grew. But a different standard took root. The idea that labor deserved compensation and a say. Hator's personal transformation had its own limits. At night he woke sometimes with the memory of the whip in his hand, a reflexive touch that grief could not correct. He had nightmares filled with faces he had ordered away. He would sit by the lamp and write letters to people he could not find. Letters publicly framed with money, but privately loaded with apology. Some were burned unread. Others found their way to hands that accepted them as beginnings rather than ends. The children who grew into adults on the plantation learned to measure Hator with caution. For some, the man he had become offered opportunities, apprenticeships, scholarships, a modest chance at stability. For others, he remained a representation of a past harm that could not be made up for. The community's memory kept both images in equal measure. Rodrigo Tavares de Mello remained a complicated figure. He had made what some called a redemptive act in the court, yet the magistrate's earlier compromises and his own social ties lingered in rumor. He continued to administer law with a newfound seriousness about document integrity. He spoke publicly about the shame of letting a fraud go unchallenged and privately lobbied for rotating clerical duties. His conscience did not free him from the stain of earlier inaction, but it made him a less convenient instrument for corruption. Padre Matias continued to keep a careful distance from the political fray. His role as confessor and moral guide gave him a quiet power. He had held the testament like a light and had not dazzled by it. He continued to advise the council and to keep open the parish hall as a place where disputes could be aired with a modicum of dignity. He remained for many the personification of a principle, that some things are worth protecting even if doing so risks danger. As time wore on, Hator's public identity settled into a new kind of recognition. He was the man who had lost a name and regained it with a cost. He was lauded by some as a reformer and by others scorned as a belated penitent. The title of baron remained technically, yet the heavy trappings had dulled. He took fewer trips to the fairs and spent more afternoons in the fields, not as a spectacle, but as someone who wished to maintain the connection he had once ignored. The estate's new governance experimented with power shared. Once a year an assembly met where laborers could bring grievances and propose innovations. These gatherings were not idyllic. They were contentious, loud, and sometimes bitter, yet they represented a ritualized check against unilateral command. Hator consented to be bound by their decisions on certain matters. He did so, knowing he might be overturned. He did so because he had learned the cost of unaccountable action. Time finally wound his years. Hator aged, and with age came a different humility. He tried, in small acts, to live an account that matched the scale of his harm. He sat at funerals of those who had been sold and admitted before crowds the wrongness of decisions once made in ledger books and private rooms. He funded the relocation of families divided by sale when possible. Some families could not be reunited. The markets had left an indelible geography of absence. At his death, the plantation was a changed landscape. The coffee fields still rolled in waves, but now dotted with plots owned by families formerly held in bondage. Shared committees met under a small stand of trees, where men and women argued loudly and sometimes laughed loud enough to scare the passing hawks. The house on the hill, softened at the edges, held portraits and a long list of ledgers that included not only receipts, but names and testimonies. Heitor's last illness was not sudden. It crept with the kind of slowness that leaves time for words to be said and for accounts to be adjusted. Rebecca sat at his bedside many evenings. Their conversations, once a terrain of guarded sorrow, had become a map of small reconciliations. They spoke plainly about their failures and about the work left undone. Heitor confessed again and again to those he feared he had wronged and made quiet plans to ensure the estate continued under terms he had established. He named executors who included people he had once owned. He insisted that the council be empowered not only in advisory ways, but with the ability to manage certain funds. When he died, the funeral carried both mourners and those who had been his adversaries. It carried the poor and the somewhat prosperous, the landholders who remembered him as a rival, and the people who had once labored under him. Speeches were not only of praise. Some people stood to recount wrongs and to insist on commitments that could not be honored by promises alone. The ceremony finished without pretense of unity. Rather, it acknowledged the messy, mixed nature of a life bound to systems larger than one man. After his death, the estate continued in the governance model he had attempted to set. Some parts eroded under new pressures, some grew firm. The schoolhouse remained. The council continued to hold elections. The legacy Heitor left did not read like a neat moral. It was messy, imperfect, and deeply human. People told the story of the baron who had been sold into slavery and then returned. Some told it as a tale of miraculous reversal, others as a cautionary yarn about the limits of memory to cleanse past harms. If you ask a person who had been freed by his hand whether forgiveness had been easy, they would laugh. If you ask whether their lives had been improved, most would say yes, in small, pragmatic ways. If you ask whether the harm could be undone, the answer would be a harsh and truthful no. The memory that returned came with the knowledge that nothing could restore those years lost, nor could legal papers fully retrieve the intimacy of family ties torn by commerce. What the memory restored, however, was the chance to choose differently, to attempt a kind of repair that would not erase, but would reorient. The town kept the story because stories help communities remember not only how power can be taken, but how it can be interrogated. Children learned the name Tirso and Heitor in ways that made them ask what a name could do. The plantations in the region watched the shifts, and slowly laws and local norms began to be less hospitable to schemes like Bastos's. Paperwork grew more cumbersome to falsify, and the magistracy developed protocols for witnessing and rotating clerks. These changes were not total and were never secure. They had to be defended again and again. In the quiet of the night, when the shutters creaked and the wind moved through the coffee rows, the memory of a man who had once called himself master lingered in the soil. It lived not as absolution but as testimony, that to remember is both a burden and an obligation. Heitor's return to name did not wash away his crimes. It made him responsible for them in new and costly ways. He accepted that cost. Which part of this story lingers with you? Was it the moment his name was called and memory came flooding back, or the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust afterward? Share what moved you most in the comments, and if this kind of deep historical story speaks to you, like and subscribe to follow more narratives that unearth the past to explain the present.